Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm about to check in on my African nightcrawler bins. It's been a week since I fed them, but I thought I might check in to see if they need more food. I actually thought I might wait a little while longer before feeding them instead of feeding them today, but I did want to check in just to see if the dampness situation is really resolved the way I thought it was last week. And hand in hand with the moisture, I believe the moisture was the reason I was seeing a lot of mites in the bins. And even in last week's video, I saw a lot of mites, and I was wondering if I might be able to, check the bins today, see if there's still a good number of mites hanging out in there. And then today, rather than feeding them, I thought I might try to set up some bait with which I can possibly round up the mites and extract them when I finally get in there to feed the bins. So it's kind of a check-in just to see how the things look in there. And then maybe try to do a little bit of combating of the mite situation. But I won't really know until I get in there and see what's going on. So I'm going to get these up on the bench, but before I can, I've got to clear out the mess over here. I've got all kinds of stuff going on my bench over here, as you can see. The rig that you see here in front of us is kind of the next iteration of my time-lapse setups. I've got the container pretty much all set to go, and rather than using the Nikon camera that's in the back over there, the digital SLR camera, I thought I'd try to go with the GoPro, because I'm filming with my newer GoPro. This is the GoPro that I had been using up until now to create all of our worming videos. So since it's kind of not being used right now, I thought I'd give this thing a try and see what kind of results we get. So it's really down to just setting up the container, putting some materials in it, putting it into that dark little cubby hole where I usually do my filming, and getting it started. I'm just a little bit torn on what kind of setup I should go with. I'm not entirely sure there. So I'm pondering different ideas on how I can equip this setup for an interesting time lapse. So if you've got any interesting ideas, then by all means, please let me know. All right, I'm going to clear all this stuff out of here so we can check in on the African night crawlers. Now in here, we're going to find plastic coverings, but these were just put back on last week during last week's feeding. Prior to that, there had been no plastic coverings on either of these African night crawler containers. So I was trying to eliminate a little bit of excess moisture by allowing time for the bins to evaporate. Oh, I guess in my haste I forgot to put my glove on. Let me just really quickly eject these worms off of the plastic covering, and then I'll put a glove on. Okay, here we go. Let's see what I can pull off here. Just maybe get a few of them to drop off the paper. But if I can't get all of them off, I'll just fold it in half and try to shelter them from the overhead lights a little bit so they don't freak out. I always enjoy finding a bunch of worms on the top surface there on the paper. And if it wasn't for that plastic covering things up and causing a lot of moisture to recirculate there, I don't think we would be seeing that. The other nice thing is that with all this moisture out here on the top, there's all kinds of castings getting dropped everywhere. That's also a nice thing to see, is that after a week's time, to see all of this fresh casting material dropped all over the place on the top surface. In a lot of my bins recently, where I was starting to sense that there might be a little bit excess moisture, a lot of times I would just peel some of the material back, and right away I would see this kind of shimmering movement as if the entire surface were moving, and I think that was springtail activity. I think the springtail activity was spurred on by excess moisture. And when I didn't see that much springtail activity anymore, I was starting to think that maybe the excess moisture situation had been remedied in here. But then I did notice from watching last week's video, when I kind of play it back more quickly, I can tell that a lot of little white spots that are within the bin are also moving, And they're not springtails. Those are little mites from what I can tell. There's a worm cocoon. I guess I didn't know what to expect. It looked like the material might be fairly damp, but just from handling it, at least this initial handling of it, it doesn't feel too damp. It feels like it's actually just about right. So I'm glad that that's the case. I think I still see kind of a little bit of springtail activity, but you know, you'll remember I came in here in the hopes that I might be able to gauge where we stand in terms of mites. The one spot I remember seeing mites every time we came in here was on the avocado. There was a half of an avocado, you know, I think the seed is still in here too somewhere. And on the seed of the avocado, as well as within the avocado itself, we were tending to see a lot of little creepy crawly movement. So I thought that if I went straight for the avocado, that would be a good quick way to judge what the deal was. I'm definitely seeing a lot of cocoons out here, you know. Sometimes they're a little bit tough to see, but the ones that are dark color like this are the ones that are pretty far along, close to hatching. I can see one there, I can see one there. So that's promising. It's always nice to see an abundance of cocoons. Alright, let's see if we can locate that half of an avocado. It's not really doing too good at this point. It's definitely crumbling apart. I think I might have crushed the outer shell of it too when we were last in here. And the worms are, you know, starting to make their way into it, feeding on it. But the one thing I'm trying to determine here is, how do things look? I mean, in the past I had seen it pretty much covered in little white specks. I even thought that the white specks might be the grit that I use. Because I use crushed eggshell, little tiny particles, but when you play back the video, you could see everything kind of moving. So I think what we're seeing down here, I'm not sure what this is, but this might actually be an example of what I was trying to see. I think that this is just a whole bunch of little tiny mites, and it's hard to tell. You might not realize it because they're kind of slow movers. But if you take the time to observe their movement, or maybe if you watch the video played back really quick, you can definitely see them zipping around and moving. And I'm seeing scattered bits of them here and there in different locations, and they're basically on the food items. So I'm questioning at this point whether it's even necessary to take any extraordinary measures to deal with them. Because while, you know, you might have some sort of a really tempting food item that they're drawn to, and then yeah, you'll see a concentration of them hanging out in one spot, I don't think I'm seeing anything else in here that would suggest that we've got some sort of an outbreak. It does seem like we're maybe even improving over previous times when I had seen a lot of this sort of mite activity. This might also be another piece of similar food as to what they're inhabiting right there. It almost seems like their attention has been drawn to something else other than the avocado. Maybe something that they prefer even better. Here and there, I'm definitely seeing items that seem to be drawing their attention. But the avocado is something that's been in these bins for a few weeks now. And then there's other things that might take a couple weeks as well, like the stem of a banana. That's what we're seeing here too, but this one's a lot older. You could tell just the way it's starting to disintegrate. Just looking at some of this material down in here, I thought that there'd still be some decent amounts of leftover food from last week's feeding, and that was the main reason I thought I might wait a little longer on feeding this bin. But I'm starting to question whether I should switch gears here and kind of forget about trying to bait the mites out. Maybe I should just drop in a little bit more food. Chances are when we get into the other African nightcrawler container, we're going to see sort of a similar situation as far as leftovers, at least so I think. I'm seeing that there is some scraps of paper here and there. I wonder if that could be contributing to the speedy consumption of the food. Sometimes it feels like I put food into the feeding zone of some of my bins and then it just sits there for a long time, but more recently I've been paying closer attention to making sure that there's enough bedding materials going into the feeding areas hand in hand with the food. So I've been taking coffee filters and shredded paper and, you know, whatever type of carbon-based materials that I have for bedding, and making sure that the bedding is sort of positioned in under the food before I add it. And it seems to be creating an environment that the worms really favor. I like what I'm seeing here, because almost everything I'm fishing out here is scraps of paper, which isn't going to disappear overnight. It's going to take a little longer for the paper and other bedding materials to break down, because they'll always go for the food first, and they'll eventually eat the paper bedding and the leaves and whatever else you use as bedding too. But that stuff will take a little bit longer usually. So, what to do? Maybe I do switch gears at this point. Since we got a kind of a nice opening over here, and I've got some of the paper that we found when we were picking through, maybe I could just return some of this paper as well as add a little bit extra paper that I've got upstairs, a few more coffee filters that I've been setting aside from the past few days that we could use as a little bit extra bedding. And then maybe we'll throw in a little bit more food to go hand in hand with these leftovers. And as far as these mites are concerned, well, you know, I'm wondering if it might just make sense to grab these couple morsels that really have a large number of mites on them. Maybe I'll just take them right outside, drop them into my outdoor compost bin, and then in a way we'll be done with a good number of them right there. How's that sound? Problem solved. Kind of what I was going to do anyway if I managed to bait some of them and round them up with some sort of a tempting food morsel. I would have just been scooping them out and removing them. So maybe by doing what we did right here, we've accomplished the same objective. So yeah, you know, I'm switching gears. I'm going to go grab a few food items as well as those coffee filters so we can reassemble this feeding zone. We'll go ahead with a modest feeding on this bin, and then return these leftovers into the bin as well, and then we'll consider that as today's maintenance on these bins. So I'll shoot upstairs to grab some food and discard these mites into my outdoor compost bin, and then we'll pick up where I left off when I get back. So the food they're going to get is a lot of potato skins, some Brussels sprouts, this is some cucumber peels. There's a variety of other stuff in here too. I think there's chunks of apple, a lot of veggies, maybe some fruits, and here's some of the paper, some of the coffee filters that we're going to use as bedding too down underneath the feeding area. So let's start out just by grabbing 2 of these because I've got 4, and we'll try to shred them up into little bits to include as our bedding underneath the feeding area. Let's see if I can crumble these up a little bit to not allow them to remain flat and matted up against one another. Okay. A little bit of bedding always helps. The worms definitely appreciate it. We've also got some recycled old bedding in here from previous feedings. Let's get all that back down in there too. Okay. And now we're going to return all these food scraps that some of them have mites on them still, but I'm kind of glad that we got rid of a good number of them. So we'll see what happens going forward. I kind of like the moisture level of what's in here. We've definitely been dealing with excess moisture in this container. And last week when we decided it was probably in a recovery mode already, I wasn't 100% certain. I figured today would be the real deciding factor as to whether things were in fact kind of at a normal dryness, dampness level, so to speak, or if I have to maybe go back to drying things out again. But I think we're okay here. I'm going to check out what's on the outer edges too. Since it is a bag, you know, there is a tendency sometimes for it to air out and dry out a little bit more around the outer edges. So, not sure what to expect, but we'll try to gauge how things look in here. But I've got a feeling that things are going to be sort of a lot better than we've been seeing more recently. I think I did add grit last week, so I'm not too worried about there being enough grit in this container. So today I think we'll just skip. Today it'll just be a little bit of fresh bedding to go hand in hand with the feeding portion. And that wasn't really a huge feeding portion. I would treat that as kind of like a semi-average portion. Yeah, things look really nice out here. I like it when the material is nice and crumbly. And that's exactly what we've got going on over here. Sometimes if things are too damp, it's immediately noticeable on the glove, because the glove, I don't know, the really damp castings material just seems to stick right to the glove. And I could tell right away if we're dealing with a little bit too much moisture in the container. I think we're doing actually quite nicely in here. I think we reached just the right level of dampness in here. So let's take a quick peek on how things look on this other outer edge too. We've been distinguishing recently, at least yesterday or the day before when I fed my red wigglers, we were distinguishing between the side of the bin which faces the inside of the room, which in this case is this side of the bin, versus the side that's up against the wall, which is exposed to a little bit more of the cool outside winter temperatures, because there's no climate control down here in my basement. So up against the concrete wall, it's a little bit cooler from some of the outside air coming in. So sometimes we'll see a little bit more worm action over on the warmer side, or at least that's what I was noticing in a couple of my other bins. I'm not quite sure if that's the case here too. But this looks really nice, very nice container. Somewhere, I can't even remember what the age of this bin is anymore, but I think it is already over 100 days of age. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since September 18th?
It was 109 days ago.
Alright, so yeah, we're now in excess of 100 days. I'm trying to remember too now. I think this might be feeding number 14 or 15 for this container. A lot of times I'll usually kind of treat either 15 feedings or 100 days of age as my trigger for starting a bin towards completion. Or maybe just if the bin is really full of really nice, what seems to be finished castings. And I think all of those criteria are met at this point. So even though the bin is not quite, you know, at capacity yet, I would say far from it, I might actually start considering the taking steps at getting this bin finalized. So I'm not that interested in running bins for very, very long times, or, you know, filling up a container. I actually prefer working with somewhat less full containers where there's a lot more room to work. The whole container itself is a little lighter, easier to handle and manage. So I've on average been going about 100 days before I kind of decide that I'm going to withhold feedings and leave the worms with a little bit of time just to focus on whatever remains in the bin, any sort of little scraps of food that might be left, scraps of bedding that might be left, so that at some point soon we can work on harvesting the contents of the container. So I'm assuming we're going to be able to take a similar approach with the other container that has the African night crawlers in it too. That's kind of why I came down here with enough food to do this twice. So whatever, switching gears, but I think it's fine. Let's see if we find any mites in the other container. Alright, so in this other African night crawler container, we got a slightly different covering here. Before we had cardboard holding the plastic down, so to speak. Not that it needs to be held down, but here we've got the plastic enveloping the cardboard. At some point I had thought that this just might make for easier handling instead of having a floppy loose piece of plastic to contend with. It seemed to me like maybe if there was a piece of cardboard holding it so that I can more easily handle it, then it might make a little bit of good sense. It seems like it kind of works. That was kind of what I was striving for right there, what we saw. I'm trying to remember, I thought that this piece of newspaper was fairly new. I thought that we had just placed this in here not too long ago. And it still feels like it's pretty much intact. But like right on the outer edges, you could start to see a little bit of nibbling of the material occurring. But it seems to be holding up pretty good. All right, let's see if we can get these little guys off of here. I always enjoy having a couple of worms right there when I open up the bin. A little welcoming party. When the paper's really new, you don't see that really, but after a few weeks, the worms start to catch on to the fact that there's a nice little sort of a spa environment up on the top where the paper is, right underneath the plastic. So this bin's a little bit younger than the other container that we just dealt with. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since October 13th?
It was 84 days ago.
So this bin's 84 days of age. Not much difference. A little bit less than a month difference in their ages. But this bin looks like it's coming along quite nicely too. Here we're seeing a little bit more evidence of the kind of little bits and pieces of paper and stuff that might have been actually stemming all the way back to the build of the bin. I can't remember, you know, exactly what I used to build the bin. Usually, you know, a lot of lingering scraps of bedding is usually evidence of the original build of the bin. So let's just kind of give this bin the same treatment as we did the other one. I suppose if we encounter some bedding along the way, we could set it aside and try to put it down into the feeding area that we're going to create down here in the middle. It'll get a lot more attention than if it just sits out here on the surface, I think. Help it all break down. Just looking at the texture of this material, it's got just an interesting sort of pattern to it. It almost makes me wonder if it is in fact paper, or perhaps it's just the peel. Maybe they've eaten, you know, I think I've been adding a lot of potato peelings. Maybe they've just eaten the meaty portion off of a piece of potato peel and just haven't really broken down the peel itself yet. Or who knows, maybe it's just paper, it's hard to tell. What's this? Is this the avocado? No. Similar though, it's another tough shelled item. It's a mango seed, but the seed itself is no longer within the husk. It's just the husk of a mango seed. This sort of tough thing that you wouldn't really imagine that the worms can break down, but over time they break it down. And it's something that they don't do alone. They do it with the help of all the other little inhabitants of the bin, helping to decompose all of the material and then eventually turn it into a lovely compost for us. I'm pretty sure there is here it is. I'm pretty sure there's an avocado in here too, just like in the other one. And here too, it seems like, you know, maybe I'm seeing some little tiny white specks, which are probably mites, but definitely not as many as we saw in the other container. So maybe the situation isn't even as severe in here as it was in the other container. So at this point, maybe we've actually solved our mite situation just by doing that extraction of those chunks that seem to be inundated with mites out of the other container. I'm not sure what this is, but I can sort of sense the smell of it still. Usually the materials that you place in your bin as food for the worms kind of lose their everyday odor. Can't even tell what certain things are after they've been placed into your worm bin, but certain things do hang on to their odor a little bit longer. So I can't tell what it was per se, but I could definitely, you know, sense that it was something kind of maybe sweet, maybe plantain. I did feed plantain in a number of my bins recently, and that I think was one of the things that was sort of hanging on to its odor a little bit. And it's not a stinky odor or anything like that. There's another banana peel. It's just maybe because it's still kind of almost like a whole substance. It's not just been, you know, it's not been broken down yet. And as I disturb it and I break it open, it still kind of has its original composition. So we've definitely encountered a few food scraps from previous feedings on our way down into here. Perhaps even more than we saw in the previous bin. So I'm never quite certain which bin has more African nightcrawlers in it, whether it's this one here or if it's the VermiBag Tote that we just fed. I'd like to think that they have somewhat equal populations and that they can probably do away with more or less equal amounts of food on a regular basis, so I don't have to think so much about how much to give each bin. I could just give each bin an equivalent amount of food each time, and then I can count on each bin doing away with that much each time. But it does seem to me like we've been encountering a good amount of leftovers in here, possibly more than we saw in the previous container. And it also seems to me like we didn't really encounter quite as many worms in here either. But the one thing I'm noticing just from talking about it and thinking about it is that you know, here and there I look around and I try to like focus a little bit more on what I'm handling here, because I'm sort of rifling through it fast. But it did sort of occur to me that a lot of what I was seeing appeared to be a lot of small juvenile worms. So even if the population was not equal when I built this bin and launched off the worms in here, it is possible that the worms are compensating and populating the bin with more babies. Okay, let's start making some space in here for the application of today's portion. I just want a little bit beyond, just to see if I can see some more stuff kind of tucked in underneath here. Maybe evidence of previous feedings that we can also see how it's doing. Sometimes I feel like the most previous feeding is not really the place to find the largest number of worms. Sometimes it's the older stuff that I've pushed out further that might actually be the spot where more and more worms are going to be really breaking down some of the older materials. It's like this, for example, to me it seems like a whole bunch of little tiny juvenile worms. And I don't know if this is maybe a piece of paper. So maybe there are certain spots that they favor or if we looked, we can find more of them. But here too, I'm seeing a fair number of itsy bitsy little baby worms. So if you slow down a bit, you can catch a better glimpse of them. If you're just barreling through like I am kind of here, you might miss it. But I've got 2 more of those coffee filters that we can shred up into little bits to throw in here. Let's get that going. And then I've also got a piece of paper towel down here too. I had some hard-boiled eggs the other day, so I bought the paper towel that I had rested their shells on to dry that I bought down here. We could use this as bedding too. Oops, little baby worm. Maybe I gotta slow down here. I'm kind of launching material all over the place, including baby worms. That's a nice generous portion right there. Different types of bedding material. And we've also got this previous application of bedding material that we found on the way down. Let's return that to the feeding area too. Okay. And then we can drop in some of this older food too. Here too, you know, stuff that is probably mites. It did seem like the seed had a lot of mites on it when I reviewed last week's video. These are just the stems of some sort of veggie or whatever. I think we also found bits and pieces of what we thought might be plantain. Some other sort of pasty fruit or whatever. That might be bedding actually. So I think this is just another chunk of avocado. So this bin does seem to have a little bit more leftovers in it than the other one did. Maybe not quite as large of a population to feed in here yet, but with all those babies, that could just be you know, a matter of time before we have just as many worms in here as we saw in the VermiBag Tote. All right, here too we've got a nice size population. In this case, this is the side of the bin where it's facing the wall, where it might be a little bit cooler. But we're seeing no you know, shortage of worms on this side, that's for sure. Quite a good number of them, as a matter of fact, which is kind of nice to see. I think that kind of supports the idea there that the fresh food going down the middle is kind of nice, and you might find worms there, but it almost seems like they're possibly attracted to the stuff that's further away from the middle, which is probably full of older food items that have had a lot more time to break down. You know what? I almost you're probably already ahead of me on this, because you're probably wondering to yourself, why didn't he put the food in? I get so caught up in looking at things and checking stuff out and wondering about stuff that sometimes I miss pretty important stuff. And in this case, me being down here to basically feed these bins, to have forgotten to add the food would have been a really questionable screw up on my part. So kind of funny that I almost actually pulled a boner like that. Sure glad I didn't. A little bit embarrassing, but that's okay. I think I just got distracted by examining the material on this side of the bin and finding all those worms. So let's see if we can avoid any other similar mishaps between now and the end of the video, which should be pretty close at this point, because these were the only 2 containers that we were looking to take care of today. Definitely like the way the material on this side looks. And it certainly has, you know, lingering bits of little leaf stems and signs of bedding left over, this and that, but the color of it is so nice and dark, and it's really nice and loose, and not overly dry or damp. Like, the moisture level is almost perfect. And a good number of worms hanging out there too. Very cool. Okay, so that's where we stand with the African night crawlers today. I'm glad I didn't have to do an extraction of mites out of here. I mean, I probably could have if I really wanted to. We did see a couple bits of old food that had a fair number of mites zipping around on them. But I think, you know, mites being in your bin are kind of par for the course, and can't wig out too much just by seeing them in there. If you see too many, or what appears to be kind of an outbreak, then I could see reacting to it. And we did react in the past by trying to dry the bin a little bit more in the hopes that they would reduce their numbers. But I think we've you know, stabilized not only the dampness in here, but I think we've also stabilized the mite situation in both bins at this point, especially by having removed some of them from the other bin that we just fed too. So that was fun. Boy, I'm glad I didn't screw up by totally forgetting to add the food, although I came close. Let's get this thing covered up and put away. And I got a little bit of cleaning up to do, but not too much. Look at that. It's pretty dry, you know. When the bins are really damp and muddy and nasty, then the glove is covered in material, but here we don't have a whole lot of that, so that's a pretty good sign. So yeah, I'll take care of washing up and putting things away here, but I won't keep you around for that because that's boring. Let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up to show that you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.